I'm humbled to be with Mark and with Rich and each one of you today. I am merely a parish pastor, interested in interesting questions. And I know that each one of you in your own setting are asking the same questions, and I know John has extraordinary experience in preaching on science in his congregation. And several of you are experimenting and working with this in your own context, and I find it curious. We have a roundtable in my congregation of scientists and theologians. The theologians are mostly retired pastors and or currently working pastors. And we get together with this group and talk, and consistently I keep hearing the same story from the scientists about how they felt as though their natural curiosity, which drove them into science as when they were children, was inhibited in the church. That somehow what they believed to be just a kind of intuitive, visceral desire to ask questions was suspect. And they wrestled all of their lives with that, wanting to be believers and yet feeling their natural curiosity was not encouraged in the church, and how liberating it has been for them to sit at this table and feel their curiosity affirmed. And I've always found that curious because I found the church growing up as the place where the most interesting questions were asked. And so I continue to listen to this, and I think that this is so fascinating, but it just hasn't been my experience of the church. And so even as we hear these stories of the church, I want to continue to raise up the positive stories as well, and I know that many of you have probably experienced the same thing, that I'll just say it again consistently through my life, the place where the most engaged and engaging questions, in which there's the most free form of inquiry, in which we can meet each other with humility and passion and be provisional and excited at the same time, has always been for me the church. When I've tried to step outside the church, and I have, and in the secular academy, both teaching and studying, I've never found the questions quite as interesting. And so I think the church is a great place and the most exciting place to have these conversations. So I want to tell three stories and offer three hazards very quickly. The first story is a story of indiscretion. The Sunday after Dolly was cloned, I don't even remember what year that was, but you all remember the cloning of Dolly, who I believe Dolly is no longer with us, is that right? But the Sunday after Dolly was cloned, I was preaching in a congregation north of Chicago, and I committed the pastoral indiscretion of deciding to preach on the cloning of Dolly. And I preached with great passion about my concerns regarding cloning in general. And I actually think I was right. Well, partially right in the theological interpretation of this. But I raised it forward, and I tried to describe the science of it, right? And little did I know that sitting in the second pew of the congregation of my church was a biologist at Northwestern University whose area of research was cloning. And as I stood at the back of the sanctuary that morning shaking hands, and he came out, and Frank walked through the line and came up to me, and he looked at me in the eye, and he said, "Well, you got the science right." And then he walked on through, right? And it was this wonderful sort of moment for me because, I called him the next day and invited him to lunch, and Frank and I became best friends. And I buried his wife a couple of years later, and we became sort of fast friends and engaged about his work and about what that was all about. But I learned a couple of things from that. One was get the science right. And that doesn't mean, like we heard this morning, I think Phil Clayton was exactly right. That doesn't mean be comprehensible or comprehensive in the science, because the last thing we should be as preachers is pretend to be something we're not. I am not a scientist, nor am I trained as a scientist. Part of the way I get the science right is by saying that in the beginning, and saying what I learn is this, and what I hear is this, and what scientists have taught me is this, and try to describe it in such a way that we're being fair to the scientists and to scientific inquiry in our midst. In the midst of that, also preach pastorally. What I knew then, after knowing more about Frank's research, is that I'd call Frank when another issue came up down the road, and I was going to touch on something else that might have an impact on science. I'd call him up and say, "Frank, this is what I'm thinking about. What do you think?" Even if we disagreed on the theology of it, or he was uneasy about where I was going with the ethics of it, the fact that I reached out to him as a scientist was part of how our friendship developed and became fast during the coming years. So preach pastorally, in some sense, be honest and direct on the science. And I'm going to grab my notes so I don't forget the other things I wanted. There was another lesson in there which I too often forget. And that is preach with testimony and not judgment or argument. By testimony, I mean I can stand in my place and in my position and say what I see. But the pulpit, and this is just sort of, You may disagree with me, and you're free to disagree theologically. But I believe the pulpit is a witness stand. It is not a dais or a platform. As a witness stand, it is the place. It's the dock in the British, in the British terminology. It's the place from which I stand and point. I don't structure the courtroom. I am not an attorney when I preach. I'm not a judge when I preach. And too often as preachers, we put ourselves in the position of the defense attorney for the gospel. I am not the defense attorney for the gospel when I preach. God can defend the gospel on God's own much better than I. I'm a witness, and I'm in the witness stand in the trial that I finally neither start nor create nor finally control. But I can influence the trial, but I can't control the outcome. And that is really in the minds and hearts of those who hear. So preach from testimony and not judgment. And then from that position, don't try to cover the waterfront. Second story is a sermon in which I used a metaphor, and you may not like the metaphor and all, and as I think about it now, I don't like it very much anymore either, but at the time I liked it. And that was sort of asking the question, why is it that trees lose their leaves in the winter, right? I live in Arizona now, and that doesn't happen, but I wasn't living in Arizona then. Why do trees lose their leaves in the winter? The very time when you think, when it's most cold, when you should be most covered, the trees are the least covered and the most bare. And began to make an analogy to that, to spiritual development and depending on God in times of weakness, right? Beautiful homiletic metaphor, perhaps. And I had someone come through the line after the church service and look at me in the eye and said, I can tell you why the trees lose their leaves in the winter. It's about chloroform, and it's about, and the sap goes down, and began to give me a scientific explanation as to why my metaphor was a useless metaphor to them. Because they knew the science contradicted the metaphorical use I was trying to make of it. And I could have stopped and said, well, it really was a poetry, it was poetic, and I was trying to use an image, and it was really not about, but it didn't matter to her because she got stuck. Which takes me back to an essay written by Paul Ricoeur, a French theologian, several years ago, which I think is still a great essay, and I encourage it to you, called The Language of Faith. And in this essay, written in the 70s, he describes what he described then as the pre-hermeneutic or pre-homiletic task of the preacher, which is to restore the work of symbols and metaphors in the lives and work and hearing of the congregation. That we have a responsibility as preachers to try to restore the ability to think metaphorically, narratively, and symbolically in the life of our people in an instrumental culture in which, and by which I mean a culture in which instrumental logic or instrumental reasoning in a culture in which we give to technology, and alongside technology also the technique or technology of science, a kind of authority which tends to shape how we logic through problems. So we think about truth in terms of correspondence. That which is true is that which is directly verifiable and corresponding to the real, rather than thinking of truth as poetic manifestation of that which is real to us and to the community. Which goes to say that part of our work is epistemological. Part of our responsibility as preachers is to restore the possibility of engaging truth in multiple ways and allowing truth to be both emergent and correspondent, both manifesting the real, disclosing the possible, while hiding as well that truth is always a mystery. And to restore the work of mystery in the church, I think, is part of the pre-homiletic responsibility that we have. I'm going to skip the third story because I'm talking too long and get to the three hazards. First hazard, I think, is ragu hermeneutics. Remember, hopefully some of you have been around long enough to remember the old ragu commercials when it's in there, right? You look at the ragu bottle of spaghetti sauce. It's in there. It's all in. It's in there. And I think ragu hermeneutics is when we look at the scripture and assume it's like the cover of The Way, the Living Bible version I had when I was a teenager. That had the long list, and the list of every single life experience I could possibly have as a teenager. It had the verse that I should go to in the Bible to find the answer. And the whole assumption is it's in there. The spiritual and devotional impulse of that is beautiful. And it was very helpful and encouraging to me when I was 16. But the hermeneutic assumption of it is just wrong for a preacher. That's not what the Bible is. It's not a handbook of every question we have in life, nor is it a scientific text. We don't want to do ragu hermeneutics when we preach. The assumption is that the answer is in there. There is a world projected. And I'm going to go back to Ricoeur. There is the world of Scripture. The Scripture projects a world of possibility. It imagines a world of possibilities. And the world of possibilities brings us into a story of hope and reconciliation and redemption, which opens up the answers to our questions. But it doesn't necessarily provide scripture and verse, right? So we do, that somewhat goes without saying, but it's still there, the kind of ragu hermeneutics. But a second, and I think and this is the liberal, and I'll say this, spending a lot of my life in the kind of liberal wings of the church, the great, I think, liberal mistake is a triumphal hermeneutic, that somehow modern science finally allows us to, at long last, master the text in its archaic, anachronistic worldview. And I don't think science does that. Science doesn't allow us to finally pin it down and wrestle Scripture to the ground and control it. Scripture, or science, is a partner in an ongoing process of discovery in which Scripture is an equal partner. Scripture projects a world of possibility that not even science can imagine. So why would I use science to control Scripture? I'd rather let Scripture have its due and have its way in the work of preaching, and then have science a part of the world that Scripture imagines, so that science can also correct my interpretation and understanding of the world that it projects. And the third mistake, though, I think, in hazard is an eisegesis mistake, in which we attempt to use Scripture use science to prove Scripture. And I know we're probably at a level here where we're not, we understand that error, but I think it's still very, very tempting from a lot of different, even really sophisticated ways, and I've done it in the pulpit. I have sort of been so fascinated by some analogy between what science is discovering and what Scripture seems to project, and I've just been so tempted, and I've gone to it and I've used it, saying, science now describes something that sounds an awful lot like the Trinity, doesn't it? Right? And, in some sense, that's a beautiful thing to say. And it's true, but it's true to an extent. It's not finally if that's all, the only way I use science, I think, and please help me, correct me on this if you would, but it finally continues to reaffirm, in however unstated a way, a sense that science has authority, that Scripture is true insofar as science can conform and confirm to what we find in Scripture, that science somehow proves Scripture. And I just don't want to get into that discussion as a preacher. I don't want to cede that ground, right? I want to continue to say that Scripture opens a world of possibility in which science is a constituent dialogue partner, but I don't want to cede the ground that world is warranted or authorized by science, because I think then that depletes science as well, and finally loses the real engagement that we have in it.